Welcome to Carbon Clarity, the podcast for the carbon curious. I'm your host, Kev Cooling. I've been a sustainability practitioner for about 20 years, and I started this podcast to share insights into the world of carbon, climate change and sustainability by speaking to a whole range of people, experts in their field. If you enjoy listening to the podcast, please like it, leave a review and share with anyone else you think might be interested. Okay, that's enough of that. Let's get into the chat. Welcome to Carbon Clarity, the podcast for the carbon curious. I'm your host, Kev Cooling. Today, I am delighted to be joined by not one, but two fantastic guests. First up, we have Will Arnold, who is a technical author of the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard and also happens to be the head of sustainable materials at the Useful Simple Trust. Hi, Will.
Hello. Hi, Kev.
And we're also joined by Apeksha Gupta, who is principal consultant of ESG and Net Zero at Greengage. Hi, Apeksha.
Hello. Hi, Kev.
Well, look, thank you both for coming on the show. It's really great to be talking to you. And I mentioned the Net Zero Carbon Building Standard there, and that's the topic of our conversation today. Just regular listeners will remember that I spoke to Tom Wigg, who was also involved in the development of the standard, and I spoke to him in December 2024, just about the time when the pilot version of the standard was being launched. And now a year on, I thought it'd be really good to find out how that's gone, how people have found it, how people on the inside have found it, and how people on the outside who are trying to apply the standard have found it too. So, but before we get into that, what would be great is just to perhaps for you to introduce yourself in your own words and maybe just include why you wanted to get involved with the standard in the first place. Will, maybe you go first.
Sure. I've been involved with the standard kind of since its inception in 2022, and I even remember the research in 2021 that led to it, where the industry basically responded to this piece of research by UK Green Building Council by all saying we need something that gives us a consistent definition of what a net zero carbon building is. So I've been involved since the start. Firstly, in my previous role, when I was head of climate action at the Institution of Structural Engineers, and that institution was one of 9 founding organisations that set up the standard. And then since moving into my new role at Useful Simple Trust, where I look after sustainable materials in all their different forms, I've also stayed involved with the standard, both leading the work around embodied carbon and also leading the final writing of it to get it up to the point where we're getting version 1 out the door pretty soon. And it's funny you sort of reflecting back to your interview with Tom at the end of 2024, because it's honestly I feel like we've gone on such a journey since then, which we'll talk a bit more about later today. But it's quite nice to sort of reflect back on that period.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure it's been a really kind of busy and interesting period for you guys. And Apeksha, what about you?
So for me personally, I think the release of the pilot version of the standard triggered a general excitement in the industry and a keen interest to apply it on real world projects. The standard being performance based, covering aspects including but not limited to operational energy. So it had aspects like embodied carbon, renewable energy refrigerants that really piqued my interest. So as part of a broader role, I think Greengage's involvement in the standard has also been quite far out in terms of it started with Amrita Das Gupta Shekhar's participation in the operational energy task group while developing the pilot version. In 2025, actually, just after your podcast with Tom, as the pilot version came out, Greengage got the opportunity to participate on the standard with the standard on 2 fronts. So one was Amrita did lead the program management of the pilot testing program. And I came on the other side by real world testing of the standard by applying it to existing office buildings on behalf of one of our clients, Dorrington. So Greengage in 2025 was, in short, in summary, heavily involved with the standard. What we did on my part on real world testing is we undertook expanded net zero audits of operational and use buildings, office buildings in London, where we applied the standard to test whether these buildings could meet all applicable aspects and achieve and hopefully achieve net zero aligned status in future. So which is basically where I really wanted to get my head in, understand the standard in all entirety, and understand how it will help achieve decarbonization in these buildings in particular.
Yeah, I mean, it's we'll get on to talking about the kind of metrics and things in a minute, because I think that's a kind of a core part of the standard, isn't it? But it may be, and I don't know where they've been, Will, but it may be that some of the listeners haven't heard of the Net Zero Carbon Building Standard. So for those 1 or 2 people, could you maybe just give us the elevator pitch for the standard?
Absolutely. And it's funny because actually I find myself doing this elevator pitch for people who are fully aware that it exists and they kind of know it, because I think it's quite useful to reflect on the purpose of it as part of this. So,
Yes.
the reason the standard exists is because up until now, anybody could say that their building was net zero, and they would define what that means in their own terms. And as a result, we've got, London's first net zero office, London's first net zero office over a certain height, Northern England's first reused net zero science laboratory and stuff like that. And that's not very constructive for us to actually move forward as an industry. Giving ourselves badges for doing well with our homework only gets us so far. So the standard was born out of this desire to have a rule book for the industry, if you like. It's a rule book that describes the performance that a building has to achieve in order to be aligned with the UK's net zero laws, effectively. So the wording within the standard is quite specific, and it talks about a net zero carbon aligned building. And that word align is really important, because what you're basically saying is my building is doing everything that we need to be doing in the building industry to help get our industry down to zero carbon on this 1.5 degree pathway that the UK has committed by law to achieving. And that just didn't exist until we started working at the standard. And I think that we knew from the research done beforehand that this was needed by industry, but the interest in the standard, every time I speak about it at conferences and stuff, it's always standing room only, and several rows deep, standing room only. And when the pilot launched, hundreds and hundreds of people would join the briefing call. We had 200 and something projects put themselves forward to be part of the pilot testing scheme. That's how much they wanted to sort of take part and sense check their own buildings against it. So it's had this. It's to me, what's really strong about it is that it's always been by the industry for the industry. It's written not by some sort of faraway certification body that's trying to impose rules. It's been written by those of us who work in the industry on a day-to-day basis. It's been tested by those who are building these buildings. And through the piloting, we've sort of sense-checked how it works, could be clearer what needs to change, so that when we launch version 1 in the next month or so, what we put out there, we know works for people, it works for the industry, and it helps us start to make that change happen at the broader scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so weird, isn't it, that there really just wasn't anything consistent before the standard. So it's fantastic. It's such a massive gap.
I mean, to be fair, there's obviously, for a long time, we've had a lot of really great initiatives out there and a lot of great certification schemes. And, the progress that we've made through the likes of BREEAM and LEED and NABERS and things like that has been amazing. And we wouldn't have an industry where it is today without them. But what was always missing was something that holistically looked at the embodied carbon behind our materials, the energy use in our buildings, the need for our buildings to be generating renewable electricity so that our buildings help decarbonise the grid of the country. The need to just say we won't be putting fossil fuels into our buildings anymore. And for something to sort of join up all of those dots into one document, that was the really key piece. And to my knowledge, this is the only standard in the world that does that in that really holistic whole life carbon kind of way.
Yeah, absolutely. Apeksha, when you first saw the standard, when that pilot first came out, what were your thoughts? Did you think, oh, this looks really complicated, or it looks fairly simple, or the targets are really tricky? What were your initial thoughts?
Yeah, when the pilot version came out, just by the length and the complexity of the standard, it's really it's not bedtime reading for sure.
Yeah,
so
I think I'd agree.
It was extremely complicated, as Will mentioned. It covered so much. I mean, it really blows your mind in terms of the amount of effort that's gone in, because obviously, as I think in your previous podcast, Tom spoke about the organizations, number of organizations that were involved in the pilot. So it would in release of the pilot version, and you could just imagine the amount of effort that would have gone into it to make such a thing even possible. Not only looking at certain, cherry pick certain aspects such as embodied and operational globally has just been like net zero has just been about operational energy mostly. So that was something where you had to, when the pilot version came out, it was quite complex. You had to reread sections, interpret it correctly. Even before you start applying the standard, you really had to understand what it really wanted to do. And it just opened the curiosity of many others in the industry in terms of how do we apply it and
Yes.
our can buildings really be aligned to it?
Yeah.
And I think something that's quite interesting on that is that, like, a lot of us have been designing buildings that can achieve these sorts of metrics and limits and so on for a long time. You know, one of the reasons why I moved to the Useful Simple Trust when I came to try and work out what I was going to do in my sort of post-institutional stage of my career was because of the track record that the trust has of delivering these buildings that are already low carbon and low energy. You know, when we did the WWF Living Planet Centre, you know, this was kind of groundbreaking at the time, highly sustainable timber arch buildings, so very, very efficient use of materials with a very low energy bill inside of it. When we were refurbishing significant office projects in the centre of London back in the early 2000s, like on 55 Baker Street, when it wasn't really normal to do big refurbs like that. So we kind of, like, as an industry, we know how to do these things. What was really interesting with the standard when we were writing that pilot version was trying to get it worded in a way that was, you know, it takes those skill sets that people already have, but it then sort of gives you some very specific things you have to do to be able to demonstrate that you know how to do it. So for me to be able to say, well, 55 Baker Street clearly would have complied with the net zero carbon building standard, won't do. You have to be measuring some very specific things. And of course, in the writing of a standard, you have to set down rules for everything, because otherwise you leave everything open to interpretation. So if I've built a building in the past, do I have to do an embodied carbon assessment of it? Well, if you finished it last year, then you probably should, yes. But if you've inherited a 1,000-year-old castle, we probably know. Where do you draw the line in between? And that takes down a whole avenue of debate and discussion to work that out. And then you've got to write something very specific to put it out there. Some of the feedback we've had during the piloting has been that actually once you start using the document, it's not as daunting as it seemed in the first instance. And everyone's first reaction is like, oh my goodness, this is huge and it's broad and it's complicated. But there's only, you know, something like 12 pages on embodied carbon, and there's 8 pages on operational energy. It's just that each of these topics kind of adds up to quite a document. So for any given bit, once you start to get into it, the feedback in the pilot test was it makes a lot of sense. We've worked quite hard, particularly in the last couple of months, to look at some of the wording to try and sort of simplify a lot of the wording that was in there, to try and build on that, so that hopefully what comes out with version 1 will be with better, you know, like better received in terms of simplicity and accessibility. But yeah, this feedback of, well, we know how to do it, so we know what you're getting at, and actually once we get into it, it's okay, was quite reassuring for us as the steering group.
Yeah, is that how you find it, Apeksha? Once you got into it, once you got your head around it, it was.
Yeah,
it was
and
actually,
I think I forgot to mention in the earlier thing in terms of involvement was because we were trying the real world testing. We actually did one of the buildings called Hamilton House, which is a heritage listed office building.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, going to Will's point, it was recently refurbished. They wanted to make it a modern business center, but it is a heritage building. So can this building meet, you know, align with net zero aligned status? It had all the bells and whistles, but I'll come to that a little bit later. But we really wanted to understand whether the standard could be applied to existing buildings. If you think about these frameworks and standards that Will talked about, a lot of it is geared towards new developments, and everybody wants to get hands on to how to design it. But the standard shifts that focus to being performance based. And so if you really want to pick up the standard, get it up and running with an existing building, does it have all of it in it to kind of interpret it well in terms of how do you apply it to existing buildings?
Yeah.
So that was the key sort of thing that came out in terms of reading the standard and, you know, can it be applied to existing buildings? Is there enough clarity on it? Things like that.
It's interesting you say that feedback, Will, that once people get into it, and it's so often the case, isn't it? As you say, you've got no choice really but to write all the things you need to write in the standard, and it's just kind of, you know, hopefully people will find it easier. And it's great also that you've recognized it and maybe thinking about slightly simplifying the language in the first version. How have you found, Will, the actual pilot process itself? I don't know, for example, how much interaction have you had with those projects that have been, you know, applying the standard as a pilot?
So we had to set up this sort of whole ecosystem to be able to use people's time efficiently. So like I say, it was 200, I think 205 projects. I might be wrong on that, but it was over 200. And
that's a great sample, isn't it? That's
which is huge, right? It's absolutely huge. And you know, there was a number of sort of client bodies out there who put a handful of buildings in, or a couple of buildings, but I think it was something like 180 unique clients.
Yeah.
And, a lot of, obviously, the way the UK construction industry works means that out of those 200, I think about a third of them were London-based, but the rest was spread all over the country. And we've got, there was a dozen up in Scotland, I think, all the way down into the southwest of the country as well. So a real spread of geographies. We had every sector. So the standard touches on, I think it's 13 different building sectors. So offices, residential, healthcare, cultural and entertainment and so on. And every single one of them was represented. As you might expect, the office sector was the most heavily represented. So I think about a third of the projects were offices, and homes followed behind. They were maybe sort of 20% or so. But again, real spread and real diversity. And then within that, you've got the new buildings and the existing buildings. And as Apeksha has rightly pointed out, a real key part of the standard was changing this focus from everything being geared towards building new stuff, because we know that's not construction, that's not the industry, and it's definitely not the future of the industry. We know already that there's plenty of stats out there that say things like 80% of the buildings that we need by 2050 already exist. And actually in the UK, in terms of the emissions from the construction industry, most of that problem is energy use in today's building stock. The next biggest, so that's something like 2/3 of the problem. The next biggest chunk's embodied carbon, and then there's this tiny slither at the end that's the energy use of new buildings. And of course, that's the only bit that the building regs really tries to tackle in the future home standard and so on. So we were keen to tackle the biggest problem. So energy use in existing buildings is massive. So we've got, I think about, it's about a 50-50 split of new building, existing buildings within the pilot. I might be wrong. What that all means is, given all that huge diversity that's in there, was that sort of managing the feedback in a way that was constructive to the standard, but also constructive for the participants, was really, really important to us. These were people who the projects had paid money to be part of this testing scheme. So that we could then fund staff to help run that. And it was actually some of Apeksha's colleagues at Greengage who were running the pilot testing. And, massive thank you to Amrita and her team for doing such a great job at that. But we wanted these pilot projects to also get something out of that. So we had to treat their time quite valuably. So we said that this sort of network of interactions, they would come together on a regular basis. We were sending them out surveys to get their feedback on the amount of work that goes into aggregating the feedback on a multi-question questionnaire from 220 different projects, all of which are unique, is obviously quite something. And we were asking for feedback on all sorts of different things. So I think there's a sort of common misconception that the pilot was just about checking whether or not the limits were right. And that was actually quite a really quite a small bit of it. Mostly what the pilot was about checking the clarity of language. Had we missed anything? Had we made technical mistakes where there were loopholes that people could get through? And of course we picked some things up. That was the whole point of doing a pilot. We realized quite early on that it didn't say what to do if you have a car park full of electric vehicle charging points in it. And we thought, oh god, well, we better make sure we write something about that. Do you include them in your energy use, or do you exclude them? And therefore, do you include the area of the car park, or do you exclude the area of the car park? That kind of thing. So I mean, for us, getting that feedback was just hugely valuable in terms of how it helps us focus our time as a steering group, and then ultimately myself now trying to turn that into the text. It's meant that the work that we've been able to do as the technical steering group, which I've been a part of since the start, has been focused all around the feedback that we've got in. And of course, we've not made changes to everything on the back of every single comment, but anything that's come up regularly, or anything that's obviously been a really important issue, we've gone straight in there and we've worked out what we've had to do about it. A couple of examples are that we've been given feedback sort of anecdotally, even when the pilot launched, saying we understand why the standard is based on in-use data. It's based on the performance of a building, but we don't want to have to wait until our building's been occupied for a year, so we've got all that data before we can stick our badge on it. And actually, if you're a speculative developer, you want to be able to say it's net zero before anyone's moved in, so that you can find someone to rent it to or sell it to. And so we, off the bat, we'd heard that beforehand. We tested that with the pilot participants. They said, yes, we'd very much like to see something that means that we can sort of check that we're on track earlier on. Obviously, everyone knows that you can't do it with verified, measured data because you haven't finished yet. But there was big feedback for that. So we said, fine, we'll work out a way to do this. We set up a new working group of participants who are a mixture of those who'd helped write the pilot, and I think a few people from some of the pilot schemes have pulled into it as well. And we worked out how to write a piece that we're now calling the PC on track checks. So there's going to be a new annex in version 1 of the standard at the back that says at practical completion, you can check your current state of the build, if you like, and it will do checks on what you have created so far. There's a bit of sort of future predictions on energy and things like that. I can't give too much detail till we launch it, but that was all. All of that stuff has been shaped by that feedback, and it means that when version 1 launches, it's going to be so much more powerful than it was before. Because while at practical completion you won't be able to say this is a net zero building because you haven't actually proven it yet, you'll be able to do all these checks that will allow you to say that, we think once it is occupied and fully verified, it probably will be able to achieve it, provided we keep going and getting everything right. I mean, how powerful is that at that stage?
Absolutely. I mean, it feels like if you hadn't tackled that would have been a real barrier to uptake, because that feels like it's a real, that's something that's so valuable to the industry, as you say, all those speculative office builds and stuff out there, for sure. I was just thinking then, when you were talking about the amount of information you'd gathered and all that kind of thing, Apeksha, I don't know if it's possible to kind of, this is the first time you've applied the standard, right? So there's loads of reading involved, there's loads of getting to grips with it and all that kind of stuff. But how much extra work would you say it has been to apply the standard to the building, if you can kind of set aside all that, filling in the questionnaires and providing that feedback? Has it been a lot of extra work, or do you think actually it's not so much?
So with the standard being performance based, I think what the standard is after is evidence and data. So I think compared to doing any other certification or standards, for you to collect all that data and collect the required evidence, do the necessary assessments, make sure some of the infrastructure is in place to collect that data, all that takes time, and all that takes, you have to preempt it. So which is why I think as Bill mentioned in terms of PC on track, I think what developers need to gear in for is to have all that infrastructure in place to start collecting the required data and evidence post occupancy. So for me, because I was fortunate enough to apply to existing buildings. So for me, it was all about assessing the gaps and understanding, okay, this building has a wealth of data, metering infrastructure, sensors. I think this is the apt one to kind of take it to the standard and test all the aspects. But then all other buildings would not be. So what is that? So the standard actually has clearly laid out the evidence requirements and what is the infrastructure that your building needs, so that you can report against all of the criteria set. So I think that was really important, and that's important to bear in mind for any kind of project, be it new development or existing, to spend that time to understand what data is required, what evidence is required, and do you have that infrastructure in place to record and collect all of that data.
It's really interesting, that, isn't it? Because if you think about, even if you go, as far down, I'm going to say down the line, as far down the line as Part L, or the relevant credits under BREEAM, or even if you're kind of going for neighbours or something, and it's got that requirement to have that good infrastructure in place, the metering and everything. If that was all done properly, in your opinion, Apeksha, would that meet the requirements of the standard? If all those things were done properly, when they're so often not done properly, but if they were, do you think the standard requires you to go even further, or would that be enough?
So there are certain nuances in the standard which asks you to have a very elaborate metering infrastructure, for example, to meet the space heating and cooling requirement, for instance. Considering that buildings don't have it, it's an important point to consider. So in terms of establishing the infrastructure is one thing. Now, whether or not it meets the requirements in terms of the achievability of the limits is a different thing altogether. So one is you have the infrastructure in place to record that data. And I think that visibility of data is important. Wherever we've talking about anything performance-based, if you can't see the data, what can you do? What can you action to reduce it? To reduce the energy consumption, to reduce your space heating, cooling, and demand. So I think what the standard really sets the precedent is gain visibility by having those requirements in place, and then test it on various aspects, and then create that roadmap in terms of if it's not achieving the limits and targets, then at least you have you'll have a robust plan on how to achieve it. So that is what the standard is kind of trying to set.
Yes.
I'd also add to that just to say that the other thing it brings is this need to talk about all these items much earlier on. Because if you're at the start of a project where you're planning on retrofitting 10,000 square meters of building, or you're at the start of a project where you're planning on building new, the equivalent, it won't work if you just say, well, fine, we'll go and build it and then see how we performed. Because by definition, if that was fine, we wouldn't be in the problem we're in the first place, right? Because
Correct,
would already be doing all the things we need it to do. So clearly that's not enough. So how do we deal with this? We, at the start of a project, make a commitment to say this is going to be a net zero carbon building, or we're going to get as close to it as we damn well can. I've got a client with my useful symbol trust hat on. We've got a lab client who's thinking about building a big research building, and they're saying to us, we want to know what it would involve to do this. And so, you can get the standard out at this early stage, and you can look at materials from an embodied point of view and energy use from that perspective, and what will it mean in terms of putting PVs on the roof and so on. And you can start to say, well, in terms of the design process, we're going to have to check in quite early to see whether or not the assumptions we're making do all that. And like I said before, we know how to design low carbon buildings, right? It just means that you get an efficient grid. You don't have any unnecessarily complicated bits of structure. You don't have a basement. You use lightweight, low carbon materials where you can, and that's done most of it for you. We know how to do that, but you need to be checking in as you go. And then when those design problems come up, where all of a sudden you're now trying to balance low embodied carbon against low energy, or you're trying to balance both of them against fire safety or access or parking requirements, because this is a big out of town thing and we haven't got rid of the cars from there yet. You can start to have those conversations in a really informed way. You can talk about, there's this phrase I've used for a long time about value for carbon. It's a bit like value for money. So what is that extra carbon buying me? Well, you don't know if you don't know how much the carbon is. So you want to know what the carbon uplift's going to be, so you can work out if it's worth it. You can do all of that if you've picked up a copy of that standard at the start and have sort of set up your processes around it. And it means that by the time you get to the point where you are now collecting your metered data or your measurements of your materials against site, or you're pulling together all your EPDs, which give you the carbon content of those materials, all of these things should be in place long before that happens, because you've sort of set up the logistics for that with that mindset. And if we can start to make that a bit more standard practice, then that's what's going to really transform the industry. And actually, even if you have projects, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, this all sounds great and I want to be able to do it, there's no way my project will ever meet the limits in the standard, that's fine. As far as I'm concerned, set yourself a slightly easier limit. It won't be net zero. You have to sort of acknowledge that, but try and go through those same steps that the standard asks you to do anyway. Measure it in the same way as everyone else, because we gain consistency. Put the sub-metering and the metering in the right way. Start to take those readings. Ask your contractors to start telling you how much stuff is coming to your building sites at the appropriate time, so you can start to measure these things. Ask where it's coming from. How far is this lorry full of doors driven anyway to get here? Yeah. Because if we can get better as an industry at doing all of that, then it becomes a lot easier to then decarbonise, because you're starting to get all these metrics that are becoming a lot more visible.
I know you said, Will, that the limits and the metrics were only a small part of the feedback you got, but I guess there's something that people will be very interested in. I'd be intrigued to know, of all the pilot projects, how have they got on with those limits? Do they seem like they're about right, or some areas no and some areas yes?
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Because while the piloting was set up with the limits being a very small part of it, to most people out there, it's the most important bit of it, because they want to know, is my building going to pass or not? Right. Yeah. And if you're putting time and energy into this, that's what matters the most to you. So it is really important. Obviously, it's just a bit less technically difficult to dig into than is the wording of paragraph 5.2.6.3, as straightforward as it could be. How did people find it? I personally was, I wouldn't say surprised, pleased. I was very pleased to see that the majority of people said actually the limits are in the right sort of place. Now, right. there was differences between different sectors. Some sectors found some slightly bit harder than others, and so we're doing some little bits of tweaking. Obviously, within any given sector and type of building and so on, there's always going to be a range. And the reality of construction is that the range is always way bigger than the trend. So somebody will say, well, my building's much taller, so it was going to fail. But the reality is going tall does add a bit of upfront carbon to your materials. But what adds a lot more is putting the columns further apart. So if you're failing by a long way, you probably need to look at your column spacing first before we start worrying about the height. So that kind of thing. So we were obviously getting a bit of a range within that feedback, but by and large, we'd sort of got it right. I don't use the word surprise because we put a lot of effort in 2024 in the run-up to launching the pilot with the limits to actually stress test those limits. So for people who aren't aware, what we did back in 2023, I think this was now, was we collected data on buildings that have been built, that have been refurbished. I think it was about 500 projects worth of upfront carbon data and a few thousand projects worth of energy data. And we aggregated all that information. We QA'd it. We plugged in gaps where we thought there were gaps. We made amendments where we thought that maybe the out-of-date calculation methods were kind of underestimating things. And we used that, what we call that sort of bottom-up data, to sense check against taking the country's carbon budget and apportioning that back down. So we did this sort of top-down, bottom-up thing where for offices, we knew what should be feasible based on the data we'd seen, and we knew what we kind of needed to achieve based on that part of the budget. That gave us the draft set of limits, and the next thing we went and did was we went out to all the volunteers who'd worked for us on the different sector groups, and we said, well, what do you think of these limits? And so we'd already stress tested it before we launched for the pilot, so it wasn't a huge surprise. Maybe relief would have been the right word.
It's great to have that word validated, isn't it?
Well, exactly, and it did, and like I say, it did flush out that there were some imperfections in it, and there are some adjustments that we're in the final stages of checking against this top-down budget model at the moment, so that when we launch version 1, there'll be a few tweaks, but they're not, there's not big significant changes on it because we did get it roughly right.
Are there? I know that for some things you just kind of got a reporting requirement in there because there wasn't enough data to be able to set those limits. Have you managed to gather any more data over the course of the last year to kind of maybe try and plug those holes? Or do we think that's a kind of a slightly longer term goal?
Yeah, that was never really one of the pilot ambitions, actually. That's slightly longer term. Those pieces around life cycle embodied carbon and water use and stuff like that, I think to get to the maturity where we don't just have numbers, but we know that the numbers are right and we understand it is not something that was going to take months. That could take a few years. And so I guess it's worth saying as well that this is not, when we launch version 1, it's not the end, right? It's not that we're going to put this document out there and go away. There is a limited company, Net Zero Carbon Building Standard Limited, that exists and will continue to steward and look after the standard going forward. It'll be them who you register your project with on day one when you decide that you want your net zero carbon building status at the end of it. So it'll be their website you go to and you fill out the paperwork to get your registration number. And I guess there'll be a bit of a race to see who can get number one when that goes live. So this will continue to evolve. And so if in a year's time we've got great water use data in the data centers world, then maybe at that point it can then be incorporated, and version 1.1 will be released with a little addendum or something like that.
Okay.
So it'll continue to move. But the point of the pilot was to test what was in there as opposed to what wasn't.
No, that's fair. Okay. Let's think about the pilot process then, Apeksha. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about the building that you took through that process.
Yeah. So with us, what we did was we applied the standard to about 10 news operational office buildings located in London. They varied. Yeah, so it was 10, but in the pilot, we only submitted one. I'll come on to it. So basically, the 10 office buildings varied in age and lease types, each offering different levels of operational control. The buildings included heritage listed, Art Deco buildings, converted industrial warehouses and factories to offices, and even differed in operational arrangements. So some was single-let FRI leases, multi-let offices, to even landlord-controlled business centers like flexible working office spaces.
Yeah.
So most of these buildings were recently refurbished, which means we were applying the standard retrospectively.
Okay.
And it was extremely important to read the embodied carbon section to see if we could comply with it because we were applying it retrospectively. Most of the buildings were fossil fuel free, had a wealth of operational energy data, like I mentioned before, adequate metering infrastructure that enabled us to test the achievability of various aspects of the standard. So the one that we submitted to the pilot was Hamilton House. a Grade 2 heritage listed building in central London, which was which actually was landlord controlled, 100% landlord controlled flexible office space. And so which meant that whatever we do to the building, the landlord would be up and for it in terms of, yes, putting it up for net zero verification, or even if there were gaps identified, implementing the measures quickly to get the building to align with the standard and stuff like that. So we had carefully selected the building. As I mentioned before, I think the thing that stood out with Hamilton House was the wealth of the data. The client had put a sensor-based monitoring system in place in lieu of sub-metering, which actually could measure energy, voltage, and power factor data points from across floor levels and system levels. So that really gave that wealth of data to kind of not only apply the standard, but also, as I mentioned, do an audit approach to understand where operational efficiencies could be brought about to reduce the energy consumption even further.
Interesting. Can and this is kind of getting into a bit of kind of the geeky area, I suppose, but in lieu of sub-metering, can you just explain that?
So basically, as Will mentioned, in terms of achievability of the limits, I think offices sector are the most mature sectors, is because of the large availability of prop tech in this sector. So you don't have to go to your utility provider to meter everything. You could do a sub-metering setup, or you could do a sensor-based monitoring setup.
Just explain what that is.
So
sensor-based.
So it's basically where what you do is you take the electrical infrastructure of the building, but you just add sensors to every circuit that you want to monitor. So you're not actually putting meters or sub-meters, you're actually putting sensors. So all that is capturing is the data points that you want to measure. So for example, an IAQ sensor, for example, does various data points. So for example, this sensor was calibrated to capture energy consumption, voltage, and power factor, stuff like that. So I mean, I didn't want to get too much into technical detail, but to Will's point,
sorry, that was a little aside for me.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So the thing is, for the offices and retail sector, I mean, offices are the most mature sectors in terms of the rich data set of the building, which means that when we applied it for Hamilton House, we kind of knew that the limits were achievable in terms of the operational energy. So and that sector has so much of prop tech going for it. So you just you can get all the bells and whistles on the building to kind of then try and align with the requirements of the standard, gather good data, act on it. I think acting is more important than just gathering it, acting upon it so that you can meet your various KPIs and targets and limits of the standard.
Given that the buildings were all those 10 buildings and the one particular one that you submitted to the standard, given they all existed and been recently refurbished, did they take any retrospective action and say, actually, do you know what, we didn't do that when we refurbished building, let's do it now? Was there anything like that came out?
I think the biggest segue is to Will's point on embodied carbon. None of the buildings, when they do refurbishment works, capture embodied carbon data.
Yes.
So we had to look in the standard, like what's allowable. I think Will can come on in this in terms of how he's laid out various hierarchy of data. That you don't have to do like a one-click LC or a whole life carbon assessment for each and everything, but there is a hierarchy of data, like Will mentioned. Go to the contractor, get the bill of quantities or materials that he's put in the building and stuff like that. But we whenever we have conversation with clients, a lot of these contracts are lump sum contracts done on refurbishment projects, and you're like, so you don't have any visibility of what he's actually put in.
Yeah, which like we were saying before is a real problem if we think we're actually going to do anything about all this. I mean, we wrote the embodied carbon bit very cognizant of this as a problem. That once you've built something, the more time that has gone by, the harder it is to get hold of that information. But we also couldn't write a standard that said, well, if you've completed the building, more than 6 months ago, you don't have to worry about the embodied carbon. So that's why the standard is written in a way that any works that finish within the last 5 years, effectively from the point of verification, will need to be fully assessed for embodied. So we knew there's going to be a lot of people out there who did works that finished 5 years ago, maybe started 6 years ago or more, and are sitting there going, well, that was 2020. I wasn't asking any of my contractors to tell me how much of anything was turning up. I was just paying them to refurbish, 2,500 square meters of office space. And they gave us the go rate and we did it. So we wrote the embodied carbon bit very carefully to allow a lot of flexibility. So it is based on a sort of hierarchy, as Apeksha was just saying, whereby, if you have good bills of quantities based on as delivered products, which is so we refer to the RICS professional standard on whole life carbon throughout the embodied carbon base, and that's the sort of starting point. And obviously what that wants you to do, the sort of gold standard, if you like, is to have those as measured quantities from what came the site. But if you can't get hold of it, we don't want that to then mean that you give up on the standard. So it tells you that you can then sort of go down through these other levels. And it's the same with EPDs, so your carbon factors field materials. Ideally, you'd have an EPD specific to every single product that turns up on site, but more likely than not, they're not all going to exist at this point in time. That's absolutely fine. So we've written out a flow chart that you follow that helps you determine at what point you can get the most accurate data that you can. So we know it's a real thing. Coming back to your question about learnings from piloting, there's a great anecdote from my old counterpart from the RIBA, because she was also putting her own house through the pilot scheme. So she retrofitted, okay. It's really, really cool. So she's got this, I think it's a Georgian terrace house. It's in Bath. It's in a conservation area. So it's, from the outside looking in, you worry about all these heritage aspects getting in the way. And she and her husband, who are both architects, have done a deep retrofit of the building, which has been staged over quite a long period of time, actually. They've done, bits in different years. And they thought they'd done quite a good job of it. And they thought they'd put it into the pilot scheme. And they discovered quite quickly when they started to try and gather their data that about a third of their solar panels weren't plugged in properly and had sort of come loose. So their energy generation was 2/3 of what it should have been. And they wouldn't have known that if they hadn't been looking for that data. And to fix it took them a few, less than an hour on a Saturday afternoon or something. You get the ladders out and go and check the wiring and find the loose one and push it back in. So it's amazing what you can do with your buildings just by trying to dig into the numbers. Julie Godefroy from CIBSE always talks about how actually the first thing you need to be doing on your energy savings is nothing to do with retrofitting. It's to do with looking how you operate the building and asking whether or not the way it's being managed is appropriate. And you can usually find energy savings 10-20% just from doing that before you've done anything.
And by the way, exactly, it's free. By the way,
free. So it saves you money.
Indeed. Yeah, it pays you. Apeksha, just thinking about that, you that thing about going back and trying to find the data was one thing. Did your clients decide to make any actual physical changes to the building as a result of that? Did they think about operating it in a different way, maybe, or installing some extra, I don't know, controls on the lighting or something like that, or you just kind of testing it as is and they didn't make any changes?
Yeah, we were testing it as is because the refurbishment works happened in the past, but they literally had put so much of bells and whistles on the building that it was all about, as Will mentioned, just getting the operational practice right. Because you could put a lot of tech in your building, but if the property manager doesn't know how to use it effectively, you will have classic cases of the systems running out of hours, higher VRF set points, done by occupants, and the voltage power factor analysis gave us the fact that, oh my gosh, the equipment is not running at the optimal voltage. Yeah. You need to put a piece of kit just to get that down, because it was also an all electric building as well. So when you electrify these buildings, then these are the little nuances that you need to get into. So a lot of it was, as Will mentioned, building optimization measures that came across through the audit process, which are quick fixes. They can just get their maintenance engineers in, get it all fixed, and then monitor it. And in terms of achieving the limits with Hamilton House, it was achieving the operational energy limits. So we were okay on that front. But it was still about giving the landlord good best practice in terms of how do you efficiently operate the building, because if you achieve it, you have to maintain it. And we were trying to get around this embodied carbon thing of how do we do it, but then if that's done, and the only thing aspect that missed on the building was renewable energy because of the heritage list. But apart from all of that, if they really just fix these two things, I think that building is a perfect candidate for verification to align with the standard. So it's kind of all in the making, but we're kind of trying to chip away at it.
Brilliant. I think as well that one of the benefits you get from trying to put a building through the standard is it prepares you as designers for what then happens next time when you want to start from the beginning of the design stages to create something that will meet the standard. Until you've tried this out in anger, you don't understand all the nuances of it. It's a 100-page document. If you flick through it on a Thursday evening or do a lunch and learn on it, there's only so much you're going to learn. What you're going to learn when you actually try and apply it to a real life build it's just like far and away, right? So we, the Trust, we've got a bunch of housing projects with Crown Estate that are trying to do sort of like pioneering domestic housing designs for them. And we're looking at those numbers against the standard, because if we do that, then it means that we understand how you design and build a house that is net zero carbon. It would make no difference at all if the client didn't want it on that project. Us trying to stress test it against those buildings would still give us the skill set to then be able to say to our next clients and our next clients afterwards, this is how you do it. And I think the reason why I want to say that is because if you're listening to this podcast and you work in that world of design, you're an architect, you're an engineer, and you're not yet being asked to do this, I would encourage you to try and find a project in the office where you can try and get somebody to apply to it anyway. Because of what you learn, because of that skill set you gain out of it, and because it then means you can go to future clients or potential clients and say, well, we know how to do this, and what you just submitted for planning is going to struggle. So we need to start again. Or what you put in the competition design brief isn't going to quite work if you do want to go down this route. We know it because we've tried it. So there's a lot to be gained from using this as a learning experience at this stage, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I recall in the conversation with Tom that his hope for the future of the standard was that in a short number of years, it would be a reputational risk not to be using this, not to be applying this stuff. Absolutely. So, do you still feel that's, I mean, it feels to me like that's a great kind of ambition to have, but it also feels very realistic. And there's
a group of real estate, or a group of investors. They go under the acronym of LOTUF, and I can never remember what it stands for, but huge amounts of real estate investment between them, measured in trillions of dollars, not billions, trillions. And they did a study at the start of, I think, 2024, so this is ahead of the pilot coming out, looking at which schemes existed around the world for buildings that would help them be able to define what they thought of as a sustainable building. Because as an investor, what they want to be able to do, they've made pledges to invest a certain amount of their money into more sustainable projects every year.
Yeah.
They now need to define what that means. And they don't define it by hiring their own experts to write their own standards. They do it by looking at what standards exist and picking which ones they're going to peg it to. And Net Zero Carbon Building Standard was the only example in the whole world that they could find that did all the things they wanted it to do, in terms of it being embodied and operational, in terms of it being measured in use data, in terms of it being third-party verified. This was the only thing out there. And so if you were now to, I don't know where that piece of work went. They published a report that sort of stated all of that. But if you were now going out there looking for funding and you wanted to maximize the chances of getting good rates from your investors and for the people who are going to do you those loans, then you need to be designing sustainable net zero buildings. So the only way to do that, now that the standard exists, is to align with the standard. You say, well, we're not using that, we're doing our own thing, isn't going to cut it anymore.
It's not good
and
enough,
the more time, the more time that goes by, the stronger that will get. So you might as well start on it now rather than waiting for a few years.
Thinking we're kind of coming towards the end of our time. So thinking ahead then, have you got a sense yet of the sorts of things that are going to change from the pilots to version 1? You've already mentioned a couple of things. What sort of stuff have you kind of got in mind? If you can share that, I don't know if we can share that just yet.
Yeah, so a couple of the other things that have been announced before that we can talk about. There's another annex is going to go in about delineation. So if you are a building landlord and you have lots of tenants who have no interest whatsoever in giving you this data that we've just been talking about today, and therefore you'd struggle to get the whole building verified, that's okay now. You'd be able to use this landlord delineated route where you basically only get your part verified.
Very nice.
There's also a tenant equivalent. So if you're going to go rent space in a shared office building and no one else cares and your landlord doesn't care, you can still collect the data from the way you use and operate and retrofit your space to, again, get accredited for that. So that's got in there. There's an equivalence piece of work that's been done.
That's the one I was going to ask you about particularly,
Yeah, so that was something we've been wanting to do ever since the start. That wasn't just written in response to pilot testing. I think in the pilot standard, it even says this is coming and it has some principles of it. That will basically say from an energy point of view, if you were to gain a certain rating with certain other schemes, you now don't need to do the energy bits of the standard. And with time, we'd like to roll that out to other schemes. So maybe somebody else has written, something that's very low embodied carbon. And if you've done that, you don't need to tick off those boxes in the standard. So that's the way that's been set up.
Great.
There's all of that. The other obviously really big thing is that with the pilot, there's nothing in there about how it gets verified. So we've announced the Bureau Veritas are now the verification administrators, at least to start with. On the standard, I forget how long they'll be the only ones for. With time, that will expand. They've been announced. When version 1 goes out, it will have content within the standard about what that means in terms of interacting with the verifier, the sorts of process that will be gone through and so on. It won't at that stage it won't give you absolutely every last bit. There will be some bits coming a bit further down the line that I can't really talk about today, but that won't be far behind. But that piece within the standard about what it means from a verification perspective will be really clear. And then, to be honest, the main other thing then is just all the bits of feedback we've had along the way across all the different sectors, tidying up of the language. We got some folk at British Standards Institute, BSI, were very kind and did a bit of a review for us so we could learn from their expertise. So that's helped with some of the language. It will look like the same sort of document as the pilot one when it comes out. It will just be improved. Yeah.
And I suppose the other big question is when. Do we know that yet, or have we got a broad kind of idea of when it might come out?
Very soon. Yeah, I can tell you based on the dates above the web camera that I'm trying to hit at the moment.
Oh, right. Okay.
They don't go that far into the future. So, yeah. And I'm not quite sure what dates it's going out on, but potentially a lot of people listening to this will be listening to it after it's gone live.
Oh, right. Well, this will be out. This will be out end of February, I think. This will come out. So I think probably maybe it will be. That's very exciting. And Apeksha, what about you? What's next for you in the standard? Are you thinking of applying it to other buildings? Are you going to wait until the version 1 comes out?
I think I think I'm really excited to get my hands on version 1 and specifically on the verification piece.
Yeah.
I think as feedback to the standard, a lot of feedback was also given on the clarity, on the evidence requirements of certain aspects. So I think all of that feedback is going to get ironed out in version 1. So really looking forward to it in terms of how they've tackled that industry feedback that Will was talking about, with 200 projects coming in. Our involvement with the standard, with the closing survey, I think they kind of did say in terms of what aspects would be taken from the what feedback would be taken in version 1. So I'm really excited to see what that shapes up as.
I think you and me both.
From a personal point of view, I'm so excited that version 1 is launching now that I'm in this new role as well, because I've spent all my history on the standard has been on this side of the fence where you're writing the guidance, you're writing the rules, you're providing the training, and I was helping write the standard, and it was theoretical. And I happen to now be on the putting it into practice side of the fence with the Useful Simple Trust, and I'm really looking forward to trying my own standard out on projects for clients that I'm working with. To sort of like really road test it. I've got, I know that it works because I've seen all the pilot testers do it, but it's going to be a fun year sort of putting it into practice on real projects and working out those tweaks, those designs, that early concept, what it needs to look like and so on. I'm very much looking forward to that personally.
Yeah, I think you and so many other people, I think it's just such a brilliant piece of work, such a fantastic kind of testament to collaboration and the skills and, expertise that's out there. When it's applied in the right way, it can make such a massive difference. Well, look, thank you both so much for coming on the show and chatting me through your experiences and your knowledge of the standard. It's been great. And hopefully maybe we'll speak again in another year's time and see how things have gone. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Kev.
Thanks for listening to Carbon Clarity. If you enjoyed the show, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button, share it with your network, and subscribe to make sure you never miss another episode. Catch you next time.